الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى، ولك الحمد إذا رضيت، ولك الحمد بعد الرضا، ولك الحمد حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه. اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome everybody to 5th Ummatics Colloquium. This is our first public colloquium. We have, in our earlier colloquium, we have had a smaller number of people, mostly joined by personal invitation. This one follows our public launch of our Ummatics Colloquium website. So those who have joined, we are thrilled to have you here with us. We are thrilled to have so many people. And I simply want to welcome you all and give you a way to become closer to our project and become more involved. And you can do that in a couple of ways. If you have not registered at Ummatics Colloquium as a member of the colloquium and as someone who receives our regular updates, please do so. You may also contact any one of us about your interest in joining any of the streams, any of the actual work that the colloquium is doing. If you are an academic who is working in an area related to the Muslim Ummah in any of the capacities that we have mentioned, and perhaps in some that we may have omitted, contact us and would love to have your work be part of a future colloquium. So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. Assalamu alaikum. Anna.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem. So on to today's event. The broad theme of this quarter's colloquium is Hindu-Muslim relations in South Asia. This is a timely issue with which to start the new year as we witness worsening conditions for Muslims in India. Just last week, the NGO Genocide Watch, which predicted the 1994 Rwandan genocide, raised the alarm on the early signs of an impending genocide of Muslims, particularly those in Kashmir and in the state of Assam. Tensions have also increased following the 2019 Reorganization Act that reconstituted the state of Jammu and Kashmir, revoking its special status and entrenching Indian occupation over the region. Amid these recent developments, historicizing Hindu-Muslim relations is more important than ever, and the subject of today's presenter, Dr. SherAli Tareen's forthcoming monograph, The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship. In this work, Dr. Tarin interrogates the multiplicity of ways in which prominent Indian Muslim scholars, especially the traditionally educated Ulama, understood Islam's relationship with Hindu thought, life, and practice in early modern South Asia, from the late 18th to the early 20th century. It consists of 6 thematically oriented chapters that explore Muslim scholarly expositions on Hindu thought. The second chapter that he will present to us today focuses on how Hindu-Muslim doctrinal polemics organized around a central conceptual question, namely, how did South Asian ulama negotiate the pre-modern context of Muslim empire that informed foundational texts and attitudes towards non-Muslims, and the setting of colonial modernity that saw Indian Muslims rendered into a political and numerical minority. He argues that the loss of Muslim political sovereignty served as the immediate backdrop of intensified intra-Muslim contest on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship in the subcontinent. But paradoxically, at stake and work in these contestations were precisely the logics and promise of an imperial Muslim political theology. We're excited to explore these arguments in more depth, inshallah, and discuss them, of course, with our allocated respondents. In terms of the outline of today, we'll start with our presentation by Dr. SherAli. Dr. SherAli Tareen is an associate professor of religious studies at Franklin and Marshall College. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early modern and modern South Asia. He has also written extensively on the interaction of Islam and secularism. His book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, published by University of Notre Dame Press in 2020, received the American Institute of Pakistan Studies 2020 Book Prize and was selected as a finalist for the 2021 American Academy of Religion Book Award. We also have two respondents for today. First up is Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal. Dr. Hafsa is an assistant professor of history at Lafayette College. And inshallah, she will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by Dr. Suhaira Siddiqui. Dr. Suhaira is an associate professor of Islamic studies and theology at Georgetown University in Qatar. After our respondents have both spoken, we'll then move on to our open discussion, for which we have dedicated a whole hour for this colloquium. Attendees will, as I said, be able to submit questions via the chat box, or you can request to unmute yourselves and ask questions to the panelists directly. For our colloquium members, feel free to use the raise hand option on Zoom or put in the chat box that you'd like to ask a question, and we will, inshallah, come to you. And finally, before ending, we will have a brief Q&A with Dr. Anjem for those who want to know more details about the colloquium and the Ummatics project more broadly. So without further ado, I will pass over to you, Dr. SherAli, if you're ready.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that really wonderful introduction. I should say at the get-go, actually, I'm sitting here in Karachi, and in case my internet goes a bit unstable, I'll move somewhere else and I'll come back, inshallah. But thank you so much to Hannah. Thank you so much to Ovaimer for organizing this wonderful colloquium and to providing the space where really these often artificial boundaries between the academic study of religion and theological studies are, rendered more complicated, and to really raise this larger question of the status of the political in our midst today, which I think is a very important question. So thank you. It's really an honor and privilege to be, and thank you also to Uthman for all his efforts in making this possible. And I also want to really thank Professors Hafsa Kanjwal and Suhaira Siddiqui for their time and investment, among my favorite scholars, colleagues, and intellectuals. So it's really an honor for them to be engaging with this particular chapter. So as Hannah mentioned, this chapter that I shared, and I realize there are people who may not have had a chance to look at it. So my plan is that maybe I'll take 15 minutes to do sort of a broad analytical summary of what are the key points, the take-home points of this project more broadly and this chapter more specifically. And then I want to spend 10 minutes to connect it to this larger theme of the colloquium, the Ummatics colloquium, and to Ovaimer's central article, Who Wants a Caliphate, which of course is the intellectual bedrock of this colloquium. So, the central question that I'm interested in this current book project I've been working on, The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship, really at the heart of it is the question of the relationship between interreligious friendship and the political, and to think about how competing articulations of the political and politics come about in intra-Muslim debates and contestations on the limits and boundaries of interreligious friendship, primarily, though not exclusively, Hindu-Muslim friendship in the context of early modern and modern South Asia, from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th century. So it has 6 thematic chapters that look at different theaters and different moments of interreligious friendship when this question became one of contest, of debate among prominent Indian Muslim scholars. And the focus of the book is on the traditionally educated, the seminary madrasa educated Ulama, although I do have some modernist figures also who do play important part in this book, such as Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the founder of the Aligarh University, etc. So the central sort of question that I'm interested in here is this underlying conundrum, which I've been interested in for some time now, which I think is relevant not only to students of South Asia, but to modern Islam or Islamic studies more broadly, which is this question of, when it comes to Muslim, non-Muslim relations and normative attitudes towards those, in particular normative traditions in Islam, especially the Islamic legal tradition, there is a certain political context of Muslim empire that informs those rulings, those normative attitudes, the kinds of texts, prominent texts that we have in relation to that topic, whether we look at sort of the philosophical realm of someone like the 9th century Muslim philosopher Abul Hasan al-Amiri's Al-Ilam bi Manaqib al-Islam, or we move a bit further and look at someone like Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, ahkam al-dhimma, etc., numerous examples, including those in the Hanafi legal tradition that dominates South Asia, whereby a certain context of Muslim empire informs those normative attitudes and rulings on this particular question. And even when Muslims do not have political sovereignty, there is a certain kind of aspiration for political sovereignty and sovereign power over the other. This conjoining of the aspiration of sovereign power over the other with a certain assumption of theological superiority over the other, this conjoining of an argument for religious supremacy and authenticity with political sovereignty and power, that conjoining is a sort of working assumption that we find in the pre-modern period, even if the pre-modern period is very variegated, very diverse. It's not a monolith, certainly, but there is an underlying assumption of Muslim empire that does inform, nonetheless, this question of Muslim, non-Muslim relations. So the question I'm interested in is when that context of Muslim empire is no longer there, with the emergence of colonial power from the late 18th century onwards in South Asia and other theaters as well, how do the traditionally educated Muslim scholars, or how do Muslim scholars more broadly speaking, then engage with this question of difference and this question of interreligious friendship in a political context that is in some ways post-Muslim political sovereignty, but in a different kind of empire now that they find themselves in the context of South Asia, that is, of course, the British Empire. So that is the underlying question that I'm interested in. This question of the incongruence between the assumption of Muslim political sovereignty that informs normative attitudes on the question of Muslim, non-Muslim relations and the radically transformed conditions of colonial modernity. What kinds of new debates, normative attitudes and the kinds of contestations, intra-Muslim contestations that we see as a result of that. And the main working argument that I've proposed in this book, one of the major arguments is that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, especially now this is an argument specific to South Asia, specific to this context that I'm looking at, that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, the whole idea of sovereign power increasingly gets enshrined, increasingly gets concentrated, increasingly gets focused on the realm of everyday ritual practice, on the idea of embodied difference, marking embodied difference in the public sphere with the non-Muslim other. Or in sort of more technical terms, a certain focus on the distinctive markers of Islam in the public sphere. The category, of course, is shi'arul Islam or sha'airul Islam, which, of course, things like cow sacrifice on the occasion of Eid or everyday practice, etc., etc. So the everyday in some ways becomes a linchpin for locating sovereign power. But not all Muslim scholars agreed with this kind of a notion of sovereignty, concentrated on the everyday, concentrated on the embodied practice of everyday life, with political sovereignty now being no longer a viable option. That in some ways they realize in the post-1857 period, as in the aftermath of the Indian Mutiny, that political sovereignty is no longer available to be resurrected. So increasingly, sovereign power gets invested in the everyday. But there are not all Muslim scholars agree with this kind of a notion of sovereignty. And there were Muslim scholars who did try to locate sovereign power in other domains, such as, for example, the Caliphate, such as, for example, the Ottoman Caliphate, exactly 1 century ago in this movement that I look at in this particular chapter called the Khilafat movement that tried to pressure the British colonial government into restoring the boundaries of the Ottoman Caliphate. So there are 3 main arguments of this project more broadly, and then I'll just spend a few minutes talking about how they relate to this particular chapter that I shared with participants here. One is this argument about that I just mentioned, this concentration on the everyday ritual practice and distinctive markers of Islam as becoming a central sort of location for a certain notion of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of empire. That's one. And the kinds of responses that then sees in this context. The second is that intra-Muslim debates on the question of Muslim, non-Muslim friendship of boundaries cannot be canonized according to predetermined binaries like inclusive, exclusivist, traditionalist, modernist, Puritan, pluralist, etc. And the point here is not just to some kind of a fashionable bursting of binaries, but to make the point that these scholars are a lot more complicated than these binaries would allow us. And I'll tell you exactly how it connects to this particular chapter that I shared. And the third main argument is that oftentimes the question of interreligious friendship or Hindu-Muslim friendship had a lot more to do with intra-Muslim divisions and thorny sort of contestations. And primarily I look at the fault lines between traditionalism and modernism in South Asia, whereby there is a subtle form of differences that we find in these two kinds of traditions of Muslim scholarly thought, that at this point, you see these subtle differences being reflected in this question of interreligious friendship, more broadly speaking. So now how do these three arguments connect to the chapter that I shared with everyone here? Very quick executive summary. So this chapter is chapter 3 of the book. It's on the question of interreligious friendship. And Hannah, please indicate when I have 3 minutes left. I'm speaking from mental notes, so just let me know. I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to do a timed presentation here. Just when I have 3 minutes, just let me know. Thank you so much. So this chapter comes from a context of exactly 1 century ago, almost exactly 1 century ago, 1920, whereby you had a group of Muslim scholars, both Ulama and Muslim modernists, who come together and try to pressure the British colonial government into restoring the boundaries of the Ottoman Caliphate, called the Khilafat movement, quite well known, in scholarship. The interesting thing about this Khilafat movement, though, is that as much as it tried to restore the Ottoman Caliphate, their argument was not that Indian Muslims should be under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Caliphate, but rather it was this internationalist movement which had its central political focus on building some kind of a intra-Muslim cohesion and unity among Indian Muslims. So in some ways, it brought together the international and the national in interesting ways. One of the key protagonists of this movement is this very interesting and intriguing scholar called Abul Kalam Azad, who in some ways is a modernist, but also with traditionalist training. So one of those kinds of modernists who moves between these two categories. And he writes this very interesting text of around 250 pages or so, which later on he also translates into Arabic and publishes in Rashid Rida's Al-Manar, in which he tries to make an argument for the indispensability of the caliphate to Islam. And it's variously titled either as Jaziratul Arab or as Mas'ala-e Khilafat. So in this chapter, provide a close reading of this particular text. And primarily, the interesting thing about this text is that in this text, his main argument is twofold. One is that he tries to show the normative indispensability of the caliphate to Islam. And he makes this very provocative argument, which has some precedence, of course, that the caliphate is in fact the roots of the Sharia, and the practices that come from it are its branches. So practices like fasting, pilgrimage, prayers, etc., the obligations will have no meaning if you don't have a central fulcrum of political sovereignty. And he makes the argument that this is not only the case with theology, but it is a central natural law of centrality that is seen in all phenomena and all natural phenomena that also you see in politics. So he makes a case for the indispensability of the caliphate. He makes the case that even if the Ottomans don't have the lineage of the Quraysh, that should not disqualify them from the mantle of the caliphate. And it mobilizes some interesting references from the pre-modern and the modern sort of references, among them Al-Baqillani, Ibn Khaldun, and then more recently Al-Shawkani, etc. And I show his different moves that he makes. And the second main argument that he makes, in fact, is one in which he speaks back to empire and says that, by contravening in a matter of religious sensitivity for us, the caliphate, you in fact are contravening the secular promise of the separation of religion and politics. So in some ways, he acts as a British citizen in some ways in trying to sever that very relationship. And he, of course, is allied with Gandhi and the Indian National Congress and what is called the non-cooperation movement, which severs all ties, economic, political, and social, with the British colonial government. So his main argument is that because the British colonial government is not following through on its own promise of respecting a matter of religious sensitivity for Indian Muslims are in a situation in which they have to choose loyalty with the state or loyalty with the Sharia. So this is the kind of argument through which he speaks back to empire in making a case for the caliphate. So it's a very interesting way in which he brings together a very imperial Muslim political theology in which he's trying to resurrect the whole argument for the caliphate, but doing so also in the liberal language of speaking back to empire. So that's the kind of confluence of different traditions in his thought that I try to capture in the chapter. The second part of the chapter moves to a different thinker called Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi school in South Asia, a staunch Hanafi traditionalist and a prolific scholar who really takes Azad and his compatriots in the Khilafat movement to task by saying that, first of all, you are the modernist Western elite who now, when convenient to you, have turned against the British. You're the English-speaking elite who always scorned the Ulama and their knowledge traditions. And now when it's convenient politically for you, you have turned against the British. Secondly, he argues that by encouraging Hindu-Muslim intimacy, which was Azad's central argument, that by collaborating with the Hindus, by engaging them in a relationship of friendship, we can then come together and confront the monstrosity of British colonial government. And he actually had made the case, Azad, that launching jihad against the British is an individual obligation of every Muslim, fardul ain, and that was a very provocative argument. So Ahmad Raza Khan takes him to task and says that if you are going to confront the monstrosity of the British colonial state, that will only bring destruction upon yourself. And he says this is a ruse of Gandhi through which he's trying to destruct the Indian Muslim community. More substantively, he makes the argument that one has to make the distinction between substantive friendship or muwalat, which is a key category of this chapter. Both of these scholars are really engaging this category of muwalat or friendship or clientage, different ways in which you can understand this category. So he says that one has to distinguish between substantive friendship and mere transactional relations. So with the British, you can have mere transactional relations. You can take financial aid for Muslim institutions of education, for example, schools, for example. That's where this issue really had come about, because the Khilafat movement people had said that Muslims should completely say no to all financial aid that comes to Muslim institutions of learning. So he said you have to make a distinction between substantive friendship and mere financial relations. And the second main argument that he makes is that by encouraging Hindu-Muslim intimacy and friendship in the public sphere, you would be undermining and you would be erasing markers of Muslim distinction in the public sphere, sha'air ul Islam. So if you are going to erase the sha'air, that in some ways is erasing Muslim sovereign power. So in some ways, this imperial Muslim political theology also worked in his understanding of interreligious friendship. And he's, of course, coming from a sort of a Hanafi traditionalist standpoint. So what we find here in these two thinkers are two competing imperial political theologies. One that locates sovereign power in the institution of the Ottoman Caliphate and tries to encourage Hindu-Muslim friendship in trying to confront the British. And the other who's locating sovereign power in the everyday, in embodied practice of everyday life, and is critiquing the modernist sort of elite connected to the Khilafat movement for encouraging Hindu-Muslim intimacy in the public sphere. So what we find here is two competing articulations of the political, both being refracted through competing notions of interreligious friendship. So that in some ways is a nutshell, executive summary of this 50-page chapter. I'm sure there's a lot of sort of details that I've left out, but in a nutshell, my main objective in trying to present this case study, then to come back to the main arguments of my book, is that look, this debate cannot be canonized through a difference between a pluralist and a Puritan, or an inclusivist or an exclusivist. Notice that it is the modernist Abul Kalam Azad who's encouraging Hindu-Muslim friendship, who's then calling for jihad against the British. And it is a so-called exclusivist traditionalist, Ahmad Raza Khan, who's scorning at the idea of interreligious friendship in the public sphere, who's taking on a much more pragmatic stance and saying that you cannot take on a powerful colonial state and wage jihad against them. So these kinds of binaries really dissolve when you look at these thinkers and their complexities. The second main argument, of course, that this debate on interreligious friendship has to do with intra-Muslim thorny, unresolved issues that we see in intellectual history of South Asian Islam and modern Islam, more broadly speaking. Now, let me take a few minutes to connect it to the larger theme of the Ummatics Colloquium. So how does this sort of chapter, which in some ways is in the tradition of the academic study of religion and Islamic studies, how does it connect to these broader questions that the Ummatics Colloquium is interested in and that Owemer's article really speaks to? The one thing that I want to introduce to the conversation on this whole question of the political, I primarily read Owemer's article as trying to think about the exhaustion of the modern state and its forms and articulations of sovereignty. And it's an invitation to think about alternative understandings of the political. So one wager that I would have is that I think we need to excavate these kinds of resources from within the tradition, whether that is South Asian or Southeast Asian or whatever traditions we might have, where we think about these alternative articulations of the political that then cannot be easily canonized according to liberal secular binaries like traditionalist, modernist, inclusive, exclusive, etc., etc. So that is one point. Second point is that I think this chapter is introducing a key sort of question that has to be addressed when it comes to this question of the caliphate and the question of what kind of a political order are we imagining here or trying to articulate, which is the question of interreligious friendship, which is the question of how we think about the relationship between friendship and the political. And that's basically one of the major ways in which I see this this chapter connecting with the larger themes of the colloquium. And I want to make the point that in some ways, the distinction between the friend and the enemy, this sort of Schmittian distinction, as Carl Schmitt said in the Theory of the Partisan, one of his lesser known texts, and I'm quoting him, the core of the political he writes is not enmity per se, but the distinction of friend and enemy. It presupposes both friend and enemy. And to this, I want to add what Salman Sayyid in his really piercingly interesting book, Recalling the Caliphate, he describes the political in this way, and I'm quoting him here. He says, the political erupts when the distinction between friend and enemy takes hold. The intensity of the distinction, in other words, the intensity of enmity and amity determines the depth and range of the political. So I just want to raise this whole question about the place of friendship, the place of Muslim, non-Muslim relations and friendship in thinking about this whole question of the political and how we might engage such fragments of the tradition from the past in trying to carve and think about a politics of the future. And I just want to end my comments on this note that, I'm titling this book, The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship or Interreligious Friendship, to capture this kind of a double-edged sword of the question of friendship, in that it makes possible certain forms of, forms of collaboration, forms of possibilities, access to the other, but it also invites peril in that it is an announcement of the incompleteness of your own sovereignty over yourself. Hence, you enter into this relationship of friendship. So there is a promise of accessing and befriending the other, but through that, you also invite peril by announcing the absence of your own sovereign control and power over the self. It's an announcement of incompleteness of the self in some ways. So how do we think about that whole question of the promise and peril of friendship and how that might connect to the category of muwalat or other such categories in Muslim thought? There, I would really appreciate some sort of suggestions also about how does the idea of friendship, the work in the Muslim intellectual tradition, pre-modern and modern, and does it contain this kind of a sensibility of the promise and peril of interreligious friendship that you do see in Western philosophical thought from Aristotle onwards and so on? I'll pause and stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. SherAli, for that summary. You've raised some really interesting points that I'm sure everybody is keen to explore in the discussion. So to get us started, we have Dr. Hafsa. Dr. Hafsa, the floor is yours.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much to the Ummatics Colloquium for inviting me to serve as a discussant for SherAli Tareen's excellent and thought-provoking work. In this response, I would like to briefly point out a number of important interventions that SherAli makes in this chapter, and also link some of these important points to our broader discussions of an Ummatic framework. The question that SherAli is broadly interested in this new book project is how South Asian ulama negotiate, and I quote, negotiate the incongruence between the pre-modern context of Muslim empire that informed foundational normative texts and attitudes towards non-Muslims, and the setting of colonial modernity that saw Muslims in South Asia rendered into a numerical as well as political minority. He argues that while the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and the emergence and eventual consolidation of British colonial power and conditions in South Asia served as the immediate backdrop of intensified intra-Muslim contest on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship, paradoxically at stake and work in these contestations were precisely the logics and promise of an imperial Muslim political theology. I will return to this point about the logics and promise of an imperial Muslim political theology because I think that's an important concept that SherAli is grappling with here. In this chapter, SherAli engages with the Caliphate movement of the 1920s, which combined both the anti-colonial fervor of the non-cooperation movement against British colonial rule, as well as the desire to restore the Ottoman Caliphate in the aftermath of the First World War. Much has been written about the Caliphate movement, especially in relation to the role of Gandhi and members of the Indian National Congress in lending their support to the movement, ostensibly to gain the support of Indian Muslims in the non-cooperation movement against the British. SherAli examines the Caliphate movement from a different angle, however, how differently situated Muslim thinkers at the time either justified Indian Muslim involvement or spoke about their opposition to it. At one end of this debate stood Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who is often remembered, and in some spaces quite negatively, for his belief in the shared secular composite culture of the Indian subcontinent. his leadership in the Hindu-dominated Indian National Congress, as well as his opposition to the Pakistan project of Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League. Yet seemingly, paradoxically, Azad was also one of the major advocates of the Khilafat movement, and as SherAli details, made a resounding defense of why Indian Muslims should demand the restoration of the sovereignty of a Muslim caliphal state, and in particular, the Ottoman state. He called for Muslims not to receive funds or attend British schools under the policy of non-cooperation and work closely with Hindus and become followers of Gandhi. For Azad, it was Christians and not Hindus who posed the greatest threat to Muslims. Although his position on the anti-colonial movement in India, as well as his support of the Ottoman Caliphate seems contradictory, SherAli highlights how Azad's justification had its own internal logics. I'm curious then if Azad's support for the Khilafat movement went beyond his desire to legitimate his and other movement leaders' status as the most authoritative representatives of Indian Muslims, as has been argued by other scholars. Was Azad's support of the Gandhian anti-colonial movement in India and his belief in Muslim belonging in a secular India premised on the fact that he saw the Caliphate as a bulwark guarding Muslim political interests and futures, including of those in India? On the other side of this debate stood Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi school of thought. Khan railed against Azad and the other leaders of the Khilafat movement, arguing that they were engaging in what SherAli terms doctrinal promiscuity, in encouraging Hindu-Muslim intimacy and bringing destruction upon themselves by taking on a powerful imperial force. It was not that Khan was a huge fan of the British. Rather, he saw the need for Muslims to develop pragmatic or contractual relations with the British, which included accepting British funding to develop their schools. Rather, Khan saw the Hindus, and in particular the non-cooperation movement led by Gandhi, as the threat. He argued that it would decimate, participating in the non-cooperation movement would decimate Muslims socially and financially. Muslims would be forced to abandon their jobs and education, leaving the Hindus to usurp important positions of wealth, power, and prestige. What was most important for Khan then was that Muslims would be able to preserve their ritual distinctions in everyday life and not mix with the other. The British were allowing them to do so, and thus there was no reason for Muslims to oppose them. So this is where we come to two competing understandings of imperial Muslim political theology. And what is important to understand here is that it is because of the fact of the loss of Muslim political sovereignty under colonial modernity that such competing imaginaries exist in the first place. For Azad, it was important to restore Muslim sovereignty through the institution of the Caliphate, so that there was a singular central locus of Muslim political, theological power and sovereignty. For Khan, it was important to maintain interreligious superiority through preserving ritual distinction in everyday life. The practice of everyday life was seen as the linchpin and locus of sovereign power. Yet, as SherAli argues, despite these differences, both thinkers were haunted by the specter of modern secular power. For Azad, despite his anti-colonial stance, it was his understanding of the state, the role of the state and citizenship, as well as his valorization of the secular. It was also in the text that he used to justify his anti-British position, in this case, the Hidayah, the very same text that was canonized as the most authoritative representation of the tradition by the British. For Khan, how we understood the category of religion itself as a set of rituals was also reflective of colonial modernity. In thinking through how this chapter relates to some of our discussions on the Ummatic, I'm curious to hear a bit more from SherAli on the logics and promise of an imperial Muslim political theology. How would you define this phrase in the context of a loss of Muslim political sovereignty? In particular, I wonder how Khan's desire to maintain ritual distinction could really be seen as linked to a competing understanding of an imperial Muslim political theology. Was it not simply the result of a decimation of that very imperial political theology? I'm also interested in parsing out the relationship between an imperial Muslim political theology and an Ummatic framework. Further, bearing in mind the ways in which these competing imaginaries still replicate the discourses of secular colonial modernity, I wonder how, in our current formulations of the Ummatic, we may also be replicating the language or logics of the colonial or the post-colonial state. Finally, I was struck by the continuities of such debates, especially in the present day, as Muslims in the West in particular are forced to reckon with how they want to relate to the left or the right in the context of a neoliberal democracy. Echoes of both Ahmed Reza Khan and Azad emerge in conversations about the importance of allying with the right in order to maintain Islamic traditional orthodoxy, especially in relation to social relations and questions of gender and sexuality. Meanwhile, for those who seek an alliance with the left, countering American and Western imperialism is critical for questions of social justice, as well as the liberation of multiple Muslim homelands. In thinking through Azad's understanding of power serving as a precondition for piety, these themes resonate for more Islamic ideological leanings as well. One question for SherAli then is to help us think through some of these more recent debates. What is at stake in these more competing imaginaries of the limits of normative friendships between Muslims and non-Muslims? How, too, are the terms of this debate haunted by the specter, in this case, of neoliberal state power? And furthermore, how do we understand normative relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in a layered global context of both Muslim political sovereignty as well as abject subjugation? Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hafsa, for kicking off the conversation and ending with some really thought-provoking questions there. But before we come to them, we'll hand over to Dr. Suhaira.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you. I just want to echo again what SherAli and Hafsa have already said, and thanking the organizers of the Ummatics Colloquium for the opportunity to speak, and also for consistently gathering people to have these conversations between kind of things that are happening, I think, conversations that are happening in the community and then conversations that are happening in academia. So I've also prepared some remarks that I'm going to read, and there's some ways in which I overlap with some of what has already been said, so I apologize if some of it's repetitive, but we didn't exchange our remarks, and so that's bound to happen. So SherAli, once again in his second book, masterfully takes us on a journey through the complex terrain of Ulama discourse during colonial modernity. Though the chapter is scaffolded upon the debate regarding the normative boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship, Tarin reveals that the stakes of this debate are far beyond questions of friendship. Rather, the contestation over friendship reveals two competing political theologies and understandings of what a moral public in South Asia should look like. The two main protagonists of this chapter, Abul Kalam Azad and Ahmed Reza Khan, are no strangers to scholars familiar with South Asian Islam. Living during the height of colonial occupation and representing two competing political visions, the exploration of their thought reveals not only the intellectual tensions present in South Asia at the time, but also the commitment to address the loss of Muslim political sovereignty. Given the richness of the chapter, it was difficult to decide which thematic and intellectual thread to tug on for the purposes of my remark. Driven in part by the intellectual interests of the Ummatics Colloquium and my own scholarship, I've decided to focus on the ever so slippery concept of sovereignty. This is something that SherAli already kind of mentioned in his comments, and so I think there's some good overlap here. Debates around sovereignty have become commonplace in political theory for the last century, to the extent that Jacques Maritain, a French philosopher during the colonial period, famously remarked, and I quote, "In order to think in a consistent in political philosophy, we have to discard the concept of sovereignty." On this point, more recently, scholars have accepted a crisis in sovereignty, which has resulted from a number of intellectual and political developments shedding light on the fact that the Westphalian notion of unitary political sovereignty is not sufficient to properly analyze the forms of political union and disunion that characterize the modern world. On the other hand, scholars have not yet found a conceptual language to use with which to analyze the polyvalent forms of political life in modernity. This poses both a challenge and an opportunity for scholars in Islamic political thought. The crisis of sovereignty has ushered in the possibility of a conceptual dislocation or paradigm shift in traditional understandings of the political, which enables contributions and insights from Islamic political thought to be read anew. And it is from this vantage point that I wish to comment on Tarin's chapter. Towards the end of it, he notes that both Azad and Khan's understanding of Hindu-Muslim friendship and its limits were inextricably tied to, and I'm quoting here, competing visions of Muslim sovereign power in the conditions of colonial modernity. And those contrasting visions of sovereignty informed their conception of the idea and boundaries of the public they sought to address, persuade, and galvanize, end quote. So what exactly were these competing visions of Muslim sovereign power? I'm just going to say this for the sake of review, but I know it's kind of already been said, so I apologize for repetition. Azad, a staunch supporter of the Khilafat movement, argues that not only was Khalifal sovereignty in the form of the institution of the caliphate a religious requirement, but was a precondition for safeguarding Muslim normative practice. The normative urgency of the caliphate, which informed the Khilafat movement, led Azad to support the Ottoman Empire, align with Gandhi, and support a broad call for jihad against the British. Opposing Azad some years later was Raza Khan. He argued that the concessions made by the Khilafat movement, especially when it came to alliances made with the Hindus, undermined the imperative of Muslim socio-political superiority, which was safeguarded by preserving ritual distinction in everyday life. As Tarin notes, instead of advocating for political sovereignty, Khan articulates a vision in which it is the cultivation of Muslim distinction in the public sphere that secures sovereign power in the ruins of empire. In this sense, the sovereignty that Khan advocates for is social and religious and is crucially tied to the public sphere, whereas the sovereignty that Azad argues for is political and tied to the specific institution of the caliphate. Tarin rightfully notes that the arguments forwarded by both scholars are direct responses to colonial modernity, but this was by no means the first time in the history of Islam in which bifurcated or polyvalent notions of sovereignty were articulated. In fact, Tarin astutely observes, and I quote, that Muslim imperial desires in this context were made in thoroughly modern discursive conditions and expectations of British colonial power. This, of course, is best exemplified by Azad's valorization of secularism as a normative ideal, as best exemplified by Azad's valorization of secularization as a normative ideal. The bifurcation of sovereignty, however, is not indebted to the political and conceptual terrain of secular modernity as a whole. For example, in Ovamir Anjum's piece, Who Wants a Caliphate, he notes that there were 4 historical models of the caliphate, and it was only the first model, that of the 4 successors of the Prophet, in which religious and political authorities were not systematically distinguished, and the caliph or successor of the Prophet embodied both. And the remaining 3 models of the caliphate that emerged in Islamic history, the imperial caliphate of the late Umayyad and High Abbasid eras, the symbolic caliphate during the waning 5 centuries of Abbasid rule, the semi-integrated caliphate of the Ottomans, the crucial common factor is that the caliph did not wield religious authority except in limited public matters. Another way of saying this is that the institution of the caliphate did not represent a unified notion of political sovereignty that was solely responsible for political, socio-religious, and legal realms. Rather, polyvalent sovereignty quickly became normatively accepted, even if the theoretical ideal remained a fully integrated model based on the Prophet and his successors. In this sense, political crises and realities forced Muslim scholars in different periods to articulate polyvalent notions of sovereignty that legitimized non-ideal conditions that could not realistically be overcome. Colonial modernity thus presents another nodal point, which, while being unique for the specific challenges it presents, in other ways unsurprisingly produces competing political theologies based on different notions of sovereignty. In my own work on colonial India, which focuses more on the transformation of Islamic law, I note another type of sovereignty, namely legal sovereignty, becomes crucially important, even above and over the legal sovereignty argued by Azad or the type of socio-political sovereignty articulated by Khan. For example, Shah Abdulaziz, the son of Shah Waliullah, discussed the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in his now famous fatwa characterizing India as Dar al-Harb. Crucially for Shah Abdulaziz, the classification enabled Muslims to engage in a variety of financial transactions that were otherwise impermissible within Dar al-Islam. Though he was willing to accept the loss of political sovereignty and the concomitant change to certain substantive rulings, he was adamant that Muslims in Dar al-Harb should indeed appoint a hakim to oversee their legal affairs. And if no hakim is found, then some leader, Rais, who would assume the responsibility at least of the basic legal needs of Muslims. In his multiple fatwa on these discussions, Shah Abdulaziz ultimately concedes to the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, but seeks to ensure that Muslims maintain a sense of legal sovereignty. Continued legal sovereignty for him becomes connected both to the independence and integrity of the Muslim community, especially during a time of occupation. This focus on legal sovereignty established by him in the earlier colonial period becomes a mainstay in later discussions. For example, one of the founders of the Deobandi Madrasa, Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, echoed the position of Shah Abdulaziz and argued that in the absence of a Shari Qadi, if 2 disputing individuals agree to a matter amongst themselves, the decision would be equivalent to that of a Qadi, Hukm al-Qadi. Turning more directly to the issue of colonial legal sovereignty and the issue it posed, another leading Deobandi figure, Mufti Kifayatullah Dehlawi, argued that the rulings issued by colonial judges pertaining to Islamic law have no legal validity. At the same time, he notes that with the loss of political sovereignty, even if Muslims agree to appoint a qadi, that qadi will not truly be considered a qadi, as the appointment of qadis is the exclusive right of an independent political authority. As such, he urges Muslims of India to implore colonial officials to appoint Muslim judges. It is no surprise that for these scholars, the rulings of non-Muslim judges simply had no Shari'i validity, and for them, preserving legal sovereignty of Muslims became key. Now, if we take kind of the conversation on legal sovereignty, which I'm kind of bringing into this, and what SherAli has already mapped out in terms of political sovereignty, I want to end with a few questions tying this back into this larger discussion on sovereignty that we're trying to get towards. Starting kind of broadly, how do the polyvalent notions of sovereignty both complicate and assist the conversation around the caliphate as an aspirational symbol of decolonial politics, as Salman Sayyid puts it, and as SherAli quotes in this chapter? Two, for those actively engaged in the process of envisioning a decolonial politics, is there a way to conceptualize these competing political rationalities as stages in the piecemeal development of an autonomous political vision, or do they necessarily have to be seen as competing theologies or competing sovereignties? Three, towards the end of the chapter, Tarin notes the conceptual fragility of categories like traditional, modern, liberal, conservative. Do the polyvalent notions of sovereignty as articulated by numerous Muslim thinkers throughout history reveal that sovereignty is similarly fragile? In other words, what is the argument for it remaining a productive concept that should continue to be employed within the Muslim political imaginary today? And finally, ending with the comments I had towards the end, when we talk about the intertwining of legal and political sovereignty, where did Azad and Khan locate the Muslim legal sovereignty in their political visions? How important was it, whether we're talking about the Khilafat movement or whether we're talking about kind of the more socio-political vision that was articulated by Raza Khan? So thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Suhaira. So alhamdulillah, we've finished with all of our speakers, but before we progress onto the Q&A, Dr. SherAli, would you like to start off the discussion by responding to either of the questions that Dr. Hafsa or Dr. Suhaira put forward?
Sure. How about I take one each from these excellent questions. First of all, thank you so much, both Hafsa and Suhaira. That was a real treat. And you've done some incredible sort of readings that I could not have imagined of this text. And I just want to say that there are 99 people in this assembly now. So it'll be great if there's a discussion around these excellent questions that, of course, go beyond anything that I would be able to adequately address here. So let's have many people engage these very excellent questions. I'll just take one each from both Hafsa and Suhaira, and then maybe we can come back to them in the course of time. Let me address the question that Hafsa raised towards the end about the present moment and the connection with this debate that I'm talking about. And Hafsa, you mentioned the North American context or the Western context. But in some ways, of course, as you know better than anyone else, the significance of this debate on the contemporary South Asian context is one that I think should be highlighted. And I would take your question as an invitation to do so. With the help of this figure whom you actually alerted me to a couple of years ago, Sharjeel Imam, this activist, student at JNU Delhi, originally from Bihar, really articulate and interesting figure who was central to organizing the anti-government protests against the discriminatory laws which were passed recently by the Indian state, the NRC and CAA. And this speech of his that you had sent me a couple of years ago that he gave at, I believe, Aligarh Muslim University, in which he, among other things, it's an hour-long speech, among his other very provocative speeches that he gave around 2 years ago, exactly in 2020, January 2020, in fact, exactly 2 years ago, in the context of those protests and the Shaheen Bagh protests, in which he played a very leading role. Currently, of course, he's in jail, and and facing some very Islamophobic and monstrous charges against him of sedition as a result of those speeches. But in one of those speeches, which is a fascinating speech that he gives, among other things, of course, he's critical not only of the current sort of government and Hindu majoritarian nationalism, but about the Indian secular project more broadly speaking. And towards the end of that speech, as you had alerted to me, Hafsa, he brings up this particular debate between Abul Kalam Azad and Ahmad Raza Khan that I wrote about. And he makes the interesting point about, among other interesting points, he makes the interesting point about why is it that when it comes to the Indian nationalist narrative or the Indian curriculum, textbooks, etc., the kind of knowledge that is consumed even by Indian Muslim citizens and subjects today, why is it that it is primarily focused on figures like Abul Kalam Azad, figures who seemingly were advocates of Hindu-Muslim collaboration and intimacy and friendship, figures who collaborated with people like Gandhi, who basically in the present moment are seen as quote unquote good Muslims. And I'm trying to complicate that image of Azad also, because of which he gets either valorized or lampooned even today, and to show that there are actually some interesting complications there. On the one hand, of course, he's all for Hindu-Muslim intimacy, but on the other hand, he is in some ways deeply invested in the institution of the caliphate. He's deeply enamored by different kinds of figures from the past that don't align very nicely with the image of a secular pluralist, for example. He's a complicated figure, like many Muslim intellectual figures. And Sharjeel Imam makes this point that, why is it that someone like Ahmad Raza Khan does not get any kind of coverage in our textbooks and our sort of Indian Muslim consciousness? And he makes this very arresting comment, and I end this current book with him. The epilogue is a close analysis of that speech, where he talks about that we have not written our own history. And I'm sort of paraphrasing that exact quote. And it will take us at least 50 more years to write our own history, which actually does go beyond these kinds of liberal nationalist retellings of our own past when it comes to interreligious friendship, etc. So that's a good example of another sort of way in which this debate happening exactly 100 years ago continues to haunt the present in very significant and very immediate ways. And to answer your question, I think it is important to precisely resist this narrative of compartmentalizing the past into good Muslims and the bad Muslims. Resist this kind of a temptation to find identifiable actors from the past to align nicely with liberal secular sensibilities about who counts as the kind of Muslims that either make you feel comfortable or either make you feel better about the prospect of interreligious pluralism, or that help you stave off your minority anxieties over not being seen as a suspect community. I think that whole narrative has to be pushed back against, which of course some of us have more of a privilege to do and others not as much, as the case of Sharjeel Imam clearly shows that in fact even Indian Muslim politicians have completely left him, abandoned him, literally in jail currently. So it takes a lot of courage, and even if I don't sort of share, as someone who's in the academic study of religion, the kind of larger politics that he's a part of, I'm deeply admiring of the kind of way in which he brings together courage and this kind of intellectual nuance. So I think that is what needs to be done, which is look at these fragments from the past which disallow the liberal secular operation of compartmentalizing Muslim actors into these kind of compartments that align nicely with liberal secular desires and expectations about what a good Muslim looks like and what a bad Muslim looks like. And I think that binary needs to be constantly interrogated and challenged. So that in some ways is an inadequate response to your question. On the question of sovereignty that Suhaira raises here, my sort of brief response would be, and I think this is a very important question about, it's a question of translation. And it's a question of how do we think about this encounter between Western theoretical categories and concepts, which have their own histories, which have their own valences, which have their own problems. Of course, the idea of sovereignty in political theology is so entangled with figures like Carl Schmitt and others and their own sort of politics, that when you mobilize them in the context of analyzing and looking at Muslim intellectual traditions and debates, what are the challenges of that? What are the risks that one takes in doing so? And the sort of, again, inadequate way in which I've tried to wrestle with that question is to try to colonize these categories in a way that makes them fit and speak and allows these categories to add light and add some nuance on the texture of these intra-Muslim traditions of scholarly argument. So in some ways, to take a category like sovereignty and to disentangle it from its Westphalian sort of notions of modern state sovereignty and see how it operates in the thought of these different figures at a particular time and place, and make it work for a different kind of a normative tradition and a different kind of logic. So in some ways, taking an English category and its kind of ways in which it operates, and then colonize it and appropriate it according to one's own texture and register, which of course is a work of friction. It of course will never be a seamless kind of translation, but in some ways that might be a certain kind of, to use a sort of, at this point, a somewhat cliched sort of category, that might be a way to decolonize these categories and to unmoor them from their sort of underlying ways in which they are oftentimes tethered to the modern state and its exclusionary forms of power. So in this particular project, what I'm interested in showing, in fact, is precisely that a focus on the everyday, a focus on ritual practices as a site of religious authenticity, identity, distinction as a site of Muslim distinction, in fact, enables us to expand one's notion of the political beyond the juggernaut of the modern state. So in some ways, what I want to show is that someone like Ahmad Raza Khan and others like him are engaging in a deeply political project by thinking about Muslim distinction as a key site of Muslim sovereign power. By sovereign power, I mean a site through which one can sort of take charge of one's own identity, take charge of one's own sort of religious identity in the colonial moment. So in some ways, this focus on ritual practices and the everyday becomes a possibility of expanding the notion of the political beyond the state. So that in some ways is the way I'm trying to think about the relationship between the political, the sovereign, and friendship. So those are the three major categories of this project in some ways. But that is a thorny process, but that's basically what I'm interested in doing, rather than completely abandon this category, to rethink them and to reappropriate them in ways that work for us and connect it to the normative register of these Muslim traditions of knowledge and contestation. But I'll keep on coming back to other great, excellent points that you've raised here, but maybe I'll pause here because I'm hearing my voice a lot now.
Thank you so much, Dr. SherAli. Okay, so we'll inshallah start our Q&A for the next hour now. We have already received some questions. If anybody, however, would like to come in on the point that Dr. SherAli was just talking about and the questions raised by Dr. Hafsa, Dr. Zuhaira, if you would like to clarify anything in hearing Dr. SherAli's response, please feel free. Otherwise, we will move on to the questions that are coming in from the audience. Just a reminder that you can raise your hand to address the speakers directly, or you can submit a question, preferably through the designated Q&A box so that we do not miss it in the chat box. So if you have put your question in there, please put it in the Q&A box. We'll come quickly to Dr. Hiba to address her question. Inshallah, feel free to unmute yourself.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It was really very interesting, both the presentation and the comments. And I just wanted to comment quickly on something that was said, mainly touched upon by the three of you, which is that we have an issue with these contested concepts, specifically sovereignty. You know, it's in some writings, it's defined as opposing hakimiyya. So to deny the sovereignty of the nation state, there is discourse on hakimiyya, starting from early 20th century, somehow after the fall of the caliphate, and developing with the rise of sort of militant Islamic groups in a way, and each of the groups defined it differently and positioned it differently. So this is also very confusing. You know, on the intellectual level, it's different than its implications when it's used by the more activists, you know, more not the highly intellectual, but rather the sort of, how do we call them, the organic intellectuals, you know, Said Qutb and those who had affected very much the Islamic groups, etc. And this makes it very confusing, and sometimes even it loses its meaning, because it's just like a flag, you know, everything that you want to address every other topic, it's just like a flag. If you don't start with talking about this in their own definition, then you are somehow not fully Islamic or not fully abiding by the Islamic notions, etc. So you can look at different angles of addressing the issue of sovereignty. For example, we have a full school, for example, from Dar al-Ulum in Egypt that was talking about the Islamic system. So when they addressed the Islamic political system, al-Nizam al-Siyasi al-Islami, different writings in this with this title, they addressed from a more constitutional approach, and hence the notion of sovereignty is taken almost for granted. It's okay, because it's part of the understanding of the modern type of political entity, and then we just want to Islamize the nation state in a way, make sure that Sharia is part of it, imagine it and compare the different Islamic political systems across history with the modern one, and they didn't really create much tension. They just want to take it forward, not even mentioning, for example, Abd al-Razzaq al-Sanhuri and others earlier, but these were like in the 60s. And then you have all the debates that took place with groups that used violence and used Hakimiyya vis-a-vis sovereignty in a more loose way, in a more sort of provocative, in a more politicized manner, to use it as a tool for mobilization. And I think that this is an example of a concept. I think now, for example, one of the concepts that are facing the same inaccuracy and used basically as a weapon rather than as an analytical tool, even in a critical manner. You can completely dismiss it, but you have to engage with it and you have to define something like Islamic feminism. It's like, though it sounds a bit far-fetched from the conversation that we are having now, but it just has the same dilemma. People are afraid or concerned with the nation state secularization process, and hence whatever comes into the baggage of Muslim women's rights and presence and engagement is considered to be feminism, and just cuts the conversation very short. And there is more and more radicalization in this regard, to even sometimes deny some of the basic rights that were considered to be very accepted across history for Muslim women's presence in the public sphere. And it's becoming a very interesting debate regarding this issue on the sort of populist movements level. So I think that this is a dilemma that we are facing: the translation, as you mentioned, SherAli, and also the usage of the concept. Who is using the concept? And hence the sword starts to be rising against the person politically or the group politically, regardless of the content or the meaning. And we will be staying with this dilemma for some time, I think, unless we publicly more and more speak about these contested concepts, and what are the semantic fields issues that we are facing here. Sovereignty is, of course, on top of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Heba. Go ahead, SherAli.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those were excellent observations, and I think you're correct in your point that one has to be specific. And the problem with these kinds of sort of supple categories is that specificity can oftentimes undermine the flexibility of a category like this. But I agree with you that one has to be specific in terms of the analytical sort of purchase that one is trying to derive from a category like this. In this particular sort of my set of comments, let me try to be more specific here. I'm primarily interested in the relationship between this desire for sovereign certainty, wherever that might be located. For some, it might be located in the institution of the caliphate. Others might locate it in the practice of everyday life and in securing Muslim distinction in the practice of everyday ritual life in relation to non-Muslim others. But this relationship between the desire for sovereign certainty in terms of one's own capacity to chart one's religious life in these moments of crisis, such as after the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, and this urgency to circumscribe boundaries distinguishing the self and the other. So in some ways, this relationship between the borderlines between identity and difference and this desire for sovereign certainty in moments of crisis, that interrelationship is primarily what I'm interested in this particular project. So, for example, the political theorist Saul Newman has a very interesting recent book on sovereignty in which he writes a pithy comment that sovereignty represents an imaginary point of identity that fixes meaning and delineates borders and boundaries. It differentiates inside from outside, friend from enemy. So that's basically the relationship that I'm interested in, the way in which sovereignty and notions of sovereign power are employed to delineate the differences between the inside and the outside, the self and the other, in precisely these kinds of moments of crisis, such as late 18th and 19th century South Asia. And it could, of course, also be applicable to the current moment in some ways. So this relationship between the slippery nature of sovereignty as this supple sort of category, as this aspiration, as this desire, and the perilous nature of friendship that oftentimes invites and announces the incompleteness of one's own sovereign power over one's own self. So that is the interaction, that is the kind of conceptual interrelationship that I'm interested in through the navigation of these ulama discourses and traditions of debate on the question of interreligious friendship.
Thank you, Dr. SherAli. Okay, we have received quite a few questions in the Q&A box. Just a note to people that if they could keep their questions as concise as possible, it would be helpful because many of them are very comprehensive, mashallah, but it could take a while to read them out. I'll go for a written question first, and then we will come to you, Dr. Anjem, and then we have somebody, oh, not anymore, okay. Again, if attendees do want to ask their question directly, they can put their hand up as well, but we'll go for a written question first. So this is from Mohsen Ali. I was hoping some light could be shed on the concept of Sha'ir al-Islam in pre-modern legal discourse. Did it refer to specifically Islamic rights, such as acts of worship in the Quran, as it is used in connection to Hajj rights? Does Ahmed Raza Khan's use of Sha'ir al-Islam represent an expansion of the concept as cultural markers of distinction and not just rituals? Relatedly, given the importance of the Khalif in Hanafi legal tradition, how did Khan address the continued validity of certain fiqh obligations, such as Friday prayers, in the absence of a Khalif?
Yes, so in some ways, absolutely, you're correct. The very brief answer would be that in some ways, the expanse or the domain of this idea of sha'ir is in some ways expanded, but this has pre-modern precedents in terms of thinking about things like ritual sacrifice and so on, as the sha'ir of Islam. Of course, this, of course, in the Quran, of course, cow sacrifice is mentioned as among the wal budna min sha'ir Allah. So it has this precedence. I think the main sort of shift that does take place in the 19th century and the early 20th century is just the degree to which the sha'ir are contested and become an object of contestation on this precise question of interreligious relations. I think this did come up, earlier also in the pre-modern period, but in some ways, the sha'ir being the underlying linchpin that is seen as a threat when it comes to interreligious intimacy in the public sphere, and the kind of intensity of the threat that we see in certain forms of discourses, that is something which I think is new. The interesting thing here is that someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, who's very concerned about the erasure of the sha'ir, on this particular point, he is in complete agreement with his otherwise fierce rivals in the Deoband school, which is, of course, my first book was on this rivalry between these two major schools of South Asia. They, of course, are fiercely, bitter rivals on different questions to do with the Prophet and to do with the Prophet's knowledge and rituals like, celebration of the Prophet's birthday, etc. But on this particular question of the relationship between interreligious friendship, especially Hindu-Muslim friendship and relations in the public sphere, and the threat that it poses to the distinguishing markers of Islam, there is tremendous overlap and convergence between, say, an Ahmad Raza Khan or, say, major scholars of the Deoband movement, like, say, Maulana Qari Tayyib, the grandson of one of the founders of the Deoband school, Maulana Qasim Nanutwi. So that's an interesting sort of factoid that I also just want to throw out there, of the interesting convergences that we see on this particular point as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Anjem, go ahead.
Sorry, so Muhammad Saad was before me.
He's just re-put his hand up. Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Yes, Brother Muhammad Saad, go ahead. The microphone is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So my so first of all, thanks for the speech that you have given, and I am quite out of words. Like you have kind of explored so many arenas. But the question that I wanted to ask you was that there's a famous book of Sabah Mahmood that she has written on the religious minorities in Middle East. So how can we, relate to that in terms of when we talk about the non-Muslims living in South Asia? So yeah, that was I was just I just wanted to ask you कि कोई इसका बनता है connection या नहीं बनता? Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. Yeah, very briefly, but it's a very important question you've raised. My answer to that question would be this. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the key conceptual questions I'm interested in is how the legacy of a pre-modern Muslim intellectual tradition with certain assumptions of Muslim political sovereignty, Muslim empire, informing these normative texts, dominant texts. It's not a uniform sort of attitude, but dominant texts. How is that engaged? How is that interpreted by these scholars living in the 19th century that are not living in the context of Muslim political sovereignty, but in fact, in some ways, the aftermath of Muslim political sovereignty in this particular context of South Asia? And what I'm really trying to show in this chapter, in this whole book, is the sort of very creative ways in which they deal with that legacy on the one hand, and the new conditions of colonial modernity on the other hand. So what I'm trying to show is that they do some very ingenious readings of the tradition in which they're trying to secure and inherit the kind of imperial political theology of the Muslim normative tradition, and they're not trying to sever their labor from that Muslim imperial political theology, but at the same time trying to engage the new conditions of colonial modernity. At the same time, so in some ways, implicitly, there is a certain kind of way in which I'm trying to think about, and that connects to this Ummatics theme also. What do we do with that assumption of Muslim imperial political theology in this new context when that political sovereignty is no longer there? That's the underlying sort of question that I'm trying to raise here. At the same time, I would be emphatic in emphasizing, and this is where Sabah Mahmood's work is very relevant, and other scholars of her sort of ilk, in that at the same time as one might think about the Muslim imperial political theology of the pre-modern past in more critical ways, it is very important not to surrender the problem of interreligious difference to the sovereignty of the modern state, to its ways in which it operates in terms of its politics of dividing humanity into majorities and minorities, and ways in which modern law, in some ways, with its foremost priority to maintain public order, privileges majoritarian sensibilities, which was one of the main arguments of that text, right? That this is an underlying irresolvable contradiction of the very structuration of the modern state, that whatever it tries to do, ultimately, because its main focus is on preserving public order through the law, it will, by its very nature, privilege majoritarian expectations and assumptions about a normative life. And that is an irresolvable contradiction, the precise trajectories of which will be different in different nation states, but it is an underlying irresolvable contradiction of modern state sovereignty. And hence we cannot surrender the problem of religious difference to the management of the modern state. So we need some kind of a mechanism of a double critique or a double sort of critical standpoint that is much more critical of modern state sovereignty, right? So in some ways, that is what I would say in response to your question, in that I think the way to engage this thorny problem is precisely to do close readings of one's own tradition, that bring out these unexpected readings of that tradition, that resist liberal secular binary framings in terms of how we think about these actors and their aspirations. That might be one avenue to think about these questions, and through that, see some kind of an alternative space might be created that is neither based on a seamless inheritance of a pre-modern Muslim imperial political theology, nor surrenders the problem of difference to the sovereignty of the modern state. That's the kind of alternative political horizon that I'm trying to sort of implicitly push for in this text, which is otherwise in the tradition of the academic study of religion. That in some ways is the political sort of implicit and not always articulated manifesto underlying what I'm trying to do here. Thank you, Saad.
Thank you, Dr. SherAli. Okay, we'll go to Dr. Anjum now. Then we'll take some of the written questions from the Q&A, and then we'll come to Brother Yahya and Irfanullah. So go ahead, Dr. Anjum.
Okay, so I'll try to be very brief. There are lots of questions. I see 10. Is it possible for us to save them and then maybe later deal with them? Perhaps we'll ask SherAli to look through them later. Is that possible? I want to make sure that none of the questions that are asked in the QA are lost. The other thing is that I want to actually I want everybody to jump in and not just have SherAli speak about everything, given that he also wants to hear from the rest of us, right? But because of the limitation of of our format and time, I'm going to just open to, in addition to SherAli, to Hafsa and Sahira. Thank you very much for especially as I heard SherAli and then your two comments later, I found that there's so much going on in my head. And so I want to sort of bring all you in on this question. One thing that I'm concerned about is the question of language that we speak, that I think, and let me explain what I mean. When I say language and the idiom in which we speak, sometimes this happened even in Islamic tradition in the past, when people would be debating a political question, but they have only fiqh language available. And one example of that is the Mawardi versus Juwayni debate on whether non-Muslims should be employed in the state. You know, Mawardi says it's okay so long as it's without a tanfeed, so long as they're simply, you know, applying the norms and not actually fully sovereign, if you will. And Juwayni, writing at a different time, during a time when there is a war with Byzantine, the Seljuks are fighting the Byzantines and the Christians are seen as dangerous, he gives a fatwa that in fact it has never been allowed, that in fact Mawardi is utterly wrong, and it's not only wrong because of political situation, he's wrong because this is the fiqh. In other words, the fiqh law speaks a universal, timeless language, whereas political situations come and go. And in hearing this debate between Azad and I talk about this in my book, that's my concern, that Muslims have lost political language, so that we basically try to legalize political questions. And if that is a correct reading, I see some of the same problems between Azad and Khan, that they're really debating, among other things, they're debating political priorities, but they have no language to speak about an Islamic political ideal. They don't have a language, so all they can do is give eternal fatwas about you being eternally wrong, and you know, and so and something similar happens among people in, for instance, Muslims today, the traditionalists and the reformists, let's call them, folks who worry about Islamophobia on the one hand and folks who worry about LGBTQ on the other hand. They're both mobilizing eternal Islamic tradition, you know, this is what Quran and Sunnah, but they're really worried about which one is a greater threat to us, our destruction of social norms, and therefore our ability to, you know, to reproduce social mores of Islam. And we want to be Muslims, you know, even if these liberals are protecting us, versus, well, to what extent is Islamophobia an eternal or a serious problem? But they don't have language for that. Same thing happens, I think, when we face, for example, problems of colonialism. And this is my reading of SherAli's reading of this, that to some degree, the traditional ulama, if they do not have the language, they run out of language, they're used to an imperial fiqhi regime, and then you don't have that available. So how do you talk about this, right? So to some degree, in my view, what happens is that there are some people who break off and are like revivalists. We're going to use new language, and you know, they're going to be labeled as modernists, they like it or not. And then there are people who are going to be what I call, you know, kayfabe. Let's pretend nothing has changed. Let's pretend that norm of the caliph still applies. And you can do kayfabe for centuries. One way to do this, I hope that people understand kayfabe, is like pretend that something is is real. But people can do that for centuries. And I talk about that in my book as like living in the waiting room, knowing, waiting for the Messiah, waiting for the Mahdi, or waiting for somebody else, but really fully living your life according to the terms that are given. So Khan, for example, seems to have accepted that, look, there is no way we can do anything about bringing the caliphate and bringing the norms back in which my fiqh is going to make sense. But I am going to, because my kayfabe is so strong, I'm going to continue using this old language. And so I guess my question is it a problem of idiom language? Is there a way for us to talk about this in a way that is, that's sort of more precise? When we're talking about, in other words, can we separate legal from political questions? That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem. I want to bring in Dr. Hafsa, Dr. Sahara. Do either of you have thoughts you want to share on the issues Dr. Anjem's raising? If not, it's okay. We can move on to questions. I don't know if people are unmuting or, yeah.
I can jump in here for a second. One of the things that struck me actually was, I was reading a fatwa of Mufti Kifayatullah when he was responding to the passage of the Child Marriages Act, which was raising the minimum marriage age. And the thing that struck me most when I was reading that fatwa is the way in which he internalized colonial language and basically was using it, but translating it into Urdu. So he was using the colonial concept of religious interference, very similar to what kind of, SherAli points towards Azad is doing and saying, you guys say that, the colonial state is not going to interfere in religious affairs, but by passing this law, you are interfering in our religious affairs. And then he has a 30-page fatwa on how he defines mudakhilat fi din. So he's literally translating the exact term, right, of religious interference into Urdu, mudakhilat fi din, and then he's giving 20 pages on how he's defining that. Now, what struck me about that is the way in which he's defining religious interference becomes so different than the way that the British are defining religious interference. And so I think part of it is that, we are stuck now in a space in which we will often use language, right? But I think the issue is when we use that language loosely and we don't define it, right? And so I think if Mufti Kifayatullah was like, this is mudakhilat fi din, it's not permissible, and then he moves on to the next thing, then we can say, you're adopting this language and you're not really giving us anything, right? But I think it's the practice of saying, look, if I'm using this term, this is how I'm going to be using it. This is how I'm going to be taking it and repurposing it or renaming it, because I don't think we can fully escape it, right? And I think this is something that Salman Sayyid says in Recalling the Caliphate. I think very early on, he talks about these concepts and says how we have to start defining them. And so I struggle with, with these, when I'm working as well, like this question of legal sovereignty, right? And the fact that a lot of these texts the political texts are so seeped in legal language. But I think it's very crucial for us to realize that oftentimes, even if, similar language is being used, it's sometimes defined in very different ways. And if we are sloppy, then we simply start to think about it in the categories or in the ways that we have already defined it. But I think there's a lot of redefining going on, and a lot of redefining should be going on. So if we want to use the concept of sovereignty, I don't want my remarks to be taken as saying, let's not use the concept of sovereignty as well at all. I use the concept of legal sovereignty quite frequently, but I think we have to then be very clear about how we're defining it, and then potentially provide alternatives if we feel that that our definitions still don't get to the heart of what we're trying to get at. And so I don't think we're ever going to escape borrowing language. On the point of whether we can remove kind of the baggage of the legal discourse from political questions, I think in large part, Islamic law has become the big elephant in the room, that it's actually taken away from a lot of other discourses. So whether we're talking about political thought, whether we're talking about theology, whether we're talking about tasawwuf, we I think sometimes want to talk about it in legal language, right? We want to use the categories of Islamic law. And I think that in of itself is a product of colonial modernity, right? That Islamic law becomes the central discourse through which we understand Muslim intellectual space, I think is something that requires a lot of attention. I think people are starting to indicate this, right? The fact that it's taking up too much airtime. And I think the question for me becomes, how do we balance between a legal discourse that is still going to be very important for how people order their normative lives, but a legal discourse at the same time, I think needs to have a place kind of separate from all of these other discourses that we need to engage in. So I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but those are my brief remarks.
Definitely makes sense. Thank you very much, Dr. Suhaila. Coming off of your points, I think I'm going to pose a couple of written questions that are kind of in the same vein. Yeah, go ahead, SherAli.
I think Dr. Hafsa says something. You turn your mic on.
I might just add a quick point. I'm thinking about the terms that have been used: power, sovereignty, imperial, violence, and all of these terms. I mean, obviously, it is a question of language, right? But it's also the epistemic tradition, the Western epistemic tradition, that informs how we are approaching all of these terms. So I'm looking at some of the questions, and so much of, I think, what we struggle with today is trying to go back to the tradition to figure out how Muslims have thought about sovereignty. But then at the same time, when we're doing that, we are still holding the Western tradition as, like the central figure, and then we are trying to approach it in different ways. I think what SherAli mentioned about expanding the political is interesting, but to me, it's also a little bit dangerous, because what that allows for is, if you locate your political in kind of the spiritual, ritualistic domain, then what does that mean for like the broader questions of what else we are commanded to do, or what else religion is supposed to be about? And I'm thinking about Ahmed Reza Khan and how he responded to British colonialism, and wondering if he would respond similarly to the Hindu fascist state today, which is actually very intent on decimating Muslim religious life and spiritual life, which, the British might not have been, the British have tried to create these little spaces where Muslims could practice and so on. But under Hindutva rule, that's no longer possible. So then at what point do you decide that inner sovereignty of just ritualistic sovereignty is not enough? And then when do you then actually try to push for political sovereignty? So I think those are all kind of all questions around language, but all questions. I think when we try to expand our analyses of some of these discourses, it runs into other kinds of dangers as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Hafsa. Dr. SherAli, do you want to respond to that?
Very briefly, I would add, I can't respond to these questions with the eloquence and brilliance of Dr. Hafsa and Dr. Suhaila, but I just want to very briefly mention 2 points about, what Weimer mentioned, this assumption of nothing has changed, the category that he used. Kafed, how do you say it, Weimer?
All right, kayfabe.
Kayfabe.
Kayfabe, kayfabe it's just a metaphor from American, this wrestling tradition where everybody knows that everything is fake, but everybody pretends
okay,
that
like
real.
WWF.
Right,
WWF.
Okay. So that's called kayfabe. And then there's some
Okay.
political work on this. Lisa Wedeen has a book on Syria where everybody acts as if they love their ruler, love their system, there is justice and whatnot. Everybody knows that's not true.
Right. So I was just going to say that, interestingly, with many figures, you have both this phenomenon as if nothing has changed, etc. But then again, switching into a very pragmatic position at the same time. So, someone like Ahmed Reza Khan, you might read him and you might think that he is really doing a seamless inheritance of a certain kind of an imperial Muslim political theology without aspiring for political sovereignty in terms of a territorial space, which he sees being impossible after the 1857 mutiny. But at the same time, the same figure then shifts to these very pragmatic ways in which he, in fact, uses the language of secularism. This is the chapter after this one, in which he says that if you compel us to cease cow sacrifice, that in fact will impinge on our quote unquote religious freedom. And that is the category which he then employs mazhabi azadi, of course, in Urdu, but clearly is using a colonial language. So that was one point, that these same figures might be operating in this kind of a timeless vestibule, but yet then have this ability to be very pragmatic and use the language of their own conditions quite adeptly. And secondly, I think the larger point that also comes up in Overmer's Who Wants a Caliphate, which is the aspirational nature of the political. I think it's a very crucial point he made at one point in that article, that the caliphate in some ways, there is no such thing as the exemplified caliphate having actually been put in place in all its absolute requirements, etc. The aspirational nature of the political, I think, is a very important point to keep in mind when it comes to analyzing these kinds of actors and issues, or this question of the legal and the political, that it is an aspirational endeavor, because that in some ways makes the political that much more interesting and also normatively striving, which is worth pursuing.
Thank you, Dr. SherAli. Okay, in the absence of anybody else wanting to come in on that particular issue, we'll take 2 from the written questions, and then we will come to Brother Yahya and Irfanullah, who want to speak directly to the panel. I'll take 2 questions that are in somewhat of a similar vein. The first is, what are the prospects of a global Muslim sovereignty in the contemporary times, coming off of the idea of what we were talking about in terms of sovereignty just now? And the second question that is somewhat related is, yes, in light of Ahmed Raza Khan's embodied sovereignty, as you put it, how is power accounted for in this formulation, especially in light of Schmitt's definition of sovereignty as an absolute arbitrary intervention, the state of exception? Broadly, can one imagine the caliphate without power? And of course, these questions are open to everybody, so please feel free to come in on that discussion and in answer to those questions. But Dr. SherAli, perhaps you would like to start us off?
Sure, very briefly. I'll take the second one. The first one is very broad, and I would invite other people who would be much more qualified to talk about global sovereignty. On the second question, so yeah, power primarily in his, I think, worldview is accumulated by having a sphere in which the practice of everyday Muslim ritual life is kept current. It is manifested, it is publicly available, and is not under any pressure or threat from the non-Muslim other. Now, how does this connect to an imperial Muslim political theology? In that the moment at which your own ritual life is being dictated or is under the pressure or coercion of a non-Muslim community, at that point, you are fracturing and you are injuring a foundational assumption of a Hanafi legal sort of paradigm, whereby the relationship between the Muslim and non-Muslim is one of domination, is one in which you are only engaging the non-Muslim other if it is a relationship of domination, right? So in this particular chapter also, he says that you can only collaborate with the non-Muslim other if that non-Muslim other is in the position of a subservient dog, that he's of course referencing from an earlier sort of text within the canon, etc. So that kind of a hierarchical power relation is injured if the choreography of your everyday life is not one which is authored by your own sovereign decision. This is how it connects to a Schmittian notion of sovereignty, in that the decision of your embodied life lies with you, and that decision is one in which you keep current and keep manifest and make publicly visible these markers of Muslim distinction, which in some ways is where Muslim sovereign power can be located and secured in the absence of a state. Now, the interesting thing is that his opponents would argue that it is precisely the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and the emergence of the British colonial state that makes possible these kinds of spaces where Muslims now are sort of consigned to ritual practice as the domain of politics. So someone like Abul Kalam Azad and others would say that this notion of the political in some ways is forfeiting a much more important a marker of Muslim distinction. So interestingly, the argument of the Khilafat movement scholars is also that in fact the Khilafat is the most important marker of Muslim distinction. So for example, in the next chapter, I look at this other scholar called Maulvi Abdul Bari of the Farangi Mahal school, the rationalist school of theology and philosophy in South Asia. And he makes a very interesting argument. He, in fact, agrees with someone like Ahmad Raza Khan that you should not seize cow sacrifice on the Eid or other occasions under the pressure or coercion of Hindus or Gandhi, etc. That would contravene the principles of the Sharia. But then he also goes on to argue that in order to secure the caliphate, if you are according to your own will and of your own volition, seizing cow sacrifice every now and then to collaborate with the Hindus and build this kind of a unified political front, then in fact, you are securing a much more important marker of Muslim distinction, the caliphate, in comparison to cow sacrifice. So he has a pithy line where he says, what is the cow when put next to the caliphate? So there again, there is a competing logic of a Muslim imperial legal and political sovereignty at work there, but being articulated and put in place and mobilized in two very different directions. So that's the kind of nuanced differences that I'm interested in here. So yeah, that's the answer to the question.
Okay, would anyone else like to come in on either of those? The first being as well the prospects of global Muslim sovereignty in contemporary times, or can one imagine the caliphate without power?
So let me actually add to the question rather than answer it, and perhaps in future something to think about for us. We need to, so I guess building on some of the comments that Hafsa, both you and Sohaira made, that look, we can't avoid using language that's available to us, and what the best we can do is be more aware, right? So that's of course pragmatically what we end up doing. But I think that when we are in the heat of decision, when we are actually practicing life, you actually, explain your decisions through languages that are available to you. And then it's not, so having a discourse that is available to you, a language that has already been used and made available, I think that helps us practice our life, our Islam better. And what I mean by that, to give you just one example, Carl Schmitt, sovereign is he who can interrupt normal legal life, make an exception. Well, think about Abu Bakr's decision in the face of Ridda wars when other Sahaba who had reasonable objection to his plan to go ahead with Ridda, he says no. In fact, this interpretation that in fact I'm not going to separate between zakat and salah, and that anybody who denies they're equally guilty, I'm going to fight them. This is the decision. That's what the caliph does. The caliph is he who chooses the better interpretation of scripture and ends the debate. Rather, in fact, not even better. It's just the authoritative interpretation of scripture. And that ends that adds for that moment the possibility of endless sectarian wars on that question. It actually allows the possibility of Muslim Ummah to be born, really. And that is what political sovereignty does, that other notions of sovereignty or don't. So anyway, to me, that's the power, that's the promise of the caliphate, that it can prevent this endless sectarianism on all possible political questions, which is not to say that you don't have actual differences. For instance, elements from SherAli's last book, where you have a different notion of the Prophet's personality and what counts as tawheed. Well, those are not questions that a caliph could or should decide. And so you're going to have differences, and there the job of a political leader is to sort of manage differences. But my point is simply, there are certain things very much in how we decide our life as Muslims. Differences are inevitable, and in conditions, in the absence of political sovereignty for Muslims, every decision, every disagreement has the potential of turning into endless, sectarianism and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem. Would anyone else like to come in and comment on that in particular? No? Okay, just before we progress on to Brother Yahya and Irfanullah, who have been waiting a long time, I know. Quickly, Dr. SherAli, people in the Q&A are asking about when, inshallah, your monograph will be released. Obviously, the panelists here today and members of the colloquium had access to the chapter, but obviously other people would like to read it following your interesting presentation. When will they be able to get their hands on that?
I've just finished the first draft and it's with the press, which will go out for review. So, you never know in the humanities how long these things take, but inshallah, maybe next year at some point, that's the hope.
Inshallah, inshallah. Okay, I am generally as well also edging more towards questions that are a little broader. If inshallah Dr. SherAli Tareen is willing, he can respond to some of the more direct queries about some things that you raised today later on and get back to people who have more detailed questions. But without further ado, let's head over to Brother Yahya. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Nice to hear you again, SherAli. Very excited to hear about your new book, and I look forward to reading it. And thanks to Dr. for convening this very excellent discussion. Really, I want to kind of pose a question to the whole panel. We seem to sometimes be caught. What I see SherAli doing is trying to open up the space in which we think about personal sovereignty, cultivation of the self, in political terms, and not see it as an abnegation of politics. And there seems to be this kind of tension in the discussion. And we also, I think, the only sort of the other thing I'd want to point out is that quite often when we look at an example like British India, responses of the Ulama to colonial modernity, we often sort of, we're in danger of looking at them within the matrix of power relations, but not understanding, if you like, their duty of care that they felt that they had. So in other words, if Muslim communal life can no longer be protected by a sovereign Muslim power, we have to go to the people, we have to emphasize education, and we have to emphasize daily ritual practices. And they had different ideas about, what that was. But I would resist the idea of reading this as a foreclosure of the return of political sovereignty. It's not necessarily a fait accompli. I think we ought to see the potentiality in the cultivation of self, the sovereign self, the potentiality of it to re-engage the emergence of, in today's world, in the post-colonial world, of a sovereign, say, moving towards a kind of greater possibilities of Muslim political sovereignty, whatever form that would take. Don't have a doctrinaire view of that, but I would resist. I'm more scared of us actually bifurcating personal sovereignty from formal state sovereignty, bifurcating that and closing that off as a potential way in which we bridge together, read together different Muslim responses to the fact of colonial modernity. Because you see, one of the legacies that we've had is that kind of conversation has been closed down. So when we now come together to look at the past in order to think about our present and dream about futures, we often therefore start to foreclose the possibility of reading into other ways in which our antagonists, if you like, responded to colonial modernity. And this is what I worry about. I'm more worried about being foreclosed than it not being opened up. And that's why I think SherAli's intervention is important, because it enabled us in a very important context of colonial India to see the possibilities of rereading these traditions in new and creative ways in order to open the conversation back up again. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Yahya. Go ahead, Dr. SherAli, would you like to respond?
I'm actually going to add a very brief addendum to your comments. Yeah, great seeing you again. Which is, I think, the larger question here is which can both be an analytical question and a more normative question to do with the themes of the Ummatics colloquium here, which is precisely when we look at these two figures, for example, there are two different conceptions of the relationship between some conception of a state or some conception of, let's call it, political sovereignty in a more traditional sense, with some territory or some kind of an institutionally based political sovereignty. Whereas for someone like Abul Kalam Azad, and many would agree with him on this point, that the very normative status of everyday ritual practice is dependent on the presence of some kind of an institutional fulcrum, some kind of institutional sort of bedrock of sovereignty, which he associates with the Ottoman Caliphate. That without that, the very normative validity of ritual practice would be invalid. So that's one way of looking at it. Whereas for someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, and many others would agree with him, that if you are resurrecting and restoring and preserving an institutional fulcrum of political sovereignty at the end of the purity of your everyday ritual identity and practice, then from the get-go, that conception of the political is in some ways vitiated, in that it is precisely through the cultivation of the self, through Muslim distinction in the public sphere, that eventually you might be able to resurrect some notion of political sovereignty. But if that is an impossibility, then fine, focus on the everyday as a marker of your sovereign sort of capacity. So that, I think, is a question here that in interesting ways continues to be relevant. It can be articulated in very different ways with the nation states that we have right now and so on. But I think that in some ways is a critical question about this relationship between the choreography of the body and the constitution of the body politic. What kind of an interaction is between them? And within that, how do we think about interreligious difference in friendship? And that's basically the one variable that I'm trying to introduce to this larger discussion around the political that in some ways Oemer's article has inaugurated. How do we think about some alternative notion of the political that does not surrender politics to the juggernaut of modern state sovereignty? So I'll just stop with that addendum.
If I could briefly respond, I mean, I guess I'm a bit more skeptical of personal sovereignty, maybe for the contemporary period. And this may not apply in the context of British colonial India, or it might, but today, those who, I guess I would kind of perhaps overlap more quietist forms of Islam today politically with those who engage with questions of personal sovereignty above and beyond political sovereignty. And that is not necessarily an organic project in many ways. It is supported by imperial powers or colonial powers. So then how do you reckon or negotiate the fact that the push towards personal sovereignty is sometimes an imperial demand to kind of make Muslims more politically quietist and allow imperial rule to occur and continue?
Am I supposed to answer that?
Oh no, just a general question.
I mean, I'll just say one line, which is that I think that it's a conscientious practice to see the restoration of Muslim political sovereignty as a spiritual practice that comes out of cultivation of self. So in other words, the political is spiritual. You're reclaiming that space. You can't personalize it or individualize it. I've just read a very interesting Sufi text written from Saudi Arabia. So it's a contemporary text about the spiritual practice of concern for the welfare of the Ummah. It's called The Body of the Ummah. It's a very interesting text about the spiritual self-cultivation of the self that cares for the political welfare of the Ummah as a spiritual practice. So I'm just giving you that as an example, that there's no reason for us to think that cultivation of self is a cultivation of selfishness. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that this was a brilliant intervention. I think it's much to think about for all of us. And thank you very much, Hafsa, for bringing up just very real day-to-day struggles that we all have. And and the imperialists do tell us that, this is your, nation state is very happy letting you cultivate your personal sensibilities. But I think that Yahya's point is well taken, that of course, ultimately all of this is played out in our private prayers with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in our jama'at and our sha'air. So both are important, but I think that just this conversation should allow us to object to cases, for example, when major Sufi and Salafi Wahhabi authorities of the world are saying, for instance, that Uyghurs are not real Muslims because maybe they don't cultivate the kind of Islam that we want, or because politically it doesn't work out. So separating those questions in the name of spiritual realities can be, of course, a great betrayal of both truth and faith. That does happen. But it doesn't necessarily need to happen. I think that Yahya's point is well taken, that kind of personal cultivation. In other words, we may not have the Ummah, but having the love for the Ummah is something that love for freedom, love for having your political say as Muslims, even though you may not fully ever realize it. I think that itself is part of Muslim cultivation.
I just wanted to comment on two quick things. One, just picking up on what Hafsa said, I think it is important to look at the ways in which the modern state, under the guise of kind of giving Muslims sovereignty, is often trying to create a type of secular religious subjectivity. And I think this is something that somebody's already mentioned, has been pointed out in some of Mahmoud's work. And I think you can really see it in the case of India, and kind of, personal status law, and saying that, the Muslims have this personal status law, but the way that Muslims are able to interact with the law, the courts, really reveal that there is a form of secular religious subjectivity that is at play. And so I think it is important to look at what are the stakes that secular power have in trying to think about, or in what role they play in actually giving these spaces, and what they're trying to cultivate when they give those spaces. So I think that's on the practical level. On the theoretical level, one of the questions I posed, and I think this is kind of connected to what Yahya said, is that can we think about these competing political rationalities as stages in the piecemeal development of kind of an autonomous Muslim political vision? And what I was trying to get at in that question is that I think when we read these political theorists, that there is always kind of a normative political ideal, right? I think we have to recognize that, but there is also continuously concessions to pragmatic realities. And I think that is very much something we see in Islamic political thought historically and in the contemporary context. And so it's a matter of balancing between, understanding what are the pragmatic concessions that should be made in a specific moment, whether those concessions are social or religious or political, but then kind of what is the aspirational ideal. And this is where I think the work needs to be done about how do we articulate that vision, and how do we even do the work or do the difficult work of kind of epistemologically unburdening ourselves from the ways in which we have been kind of caged in by modern categories, so we can even think about that vision independently. So I think there is work kind of on the foundational level to be done, and then also on the larger political level.
And just very, very briefly, I just want to make a very quick observation, which the interesting thing that is happening in this really fascinating discussion here is that on the one hand, there is this kind of concern of a notion of ritual life being seen as sort of a centerpiece of religious identity and one's own sovereign self, as being regulated by the modern state, as being managed by the modern state. And in that way, it would amplify in some ways modern state sovereignty, and perhaps would depoliticize Islam. That in some ways is the central concern being raised by Hafsa, and then amplified further by Uwaimir and Suhaira. On the other hand, Suhaira, you invoked Professor Sabah Mahmood, alayhi yarhamuha. Of course, the very point of politics of piety was that it is these forms of politics which are not primarily invested in electoral democracy or the state, etc., but primarily in terms of cultivating virtue as a form of capacity building capacity of the body, that articulates a certain logic of the political that can that is then not translatable into a certain Western feminist notion of the political. So that there is this very interesting kind of a conversation we're having here about the relationship between everyday choreography of the body and ritual life and the constitution of the political. I just wanted to make that observation.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for your points on Brother Yahya's insightful question. We'll come now to Brother Irfanullah. You can unmute yourself now, inshallah.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. SherAli Tareen. I'm most grateful to you for your presentation, and I'm exceedingly grateful to the discussants for their very insightful interventions, and to Professor Anjum for his comments. There's a lot that I want to ask about, but I'll just resist the temptation. I have very specific two questions, or maybe not questions, but rather comments, and I think they can perhaps hopefully help us kind of complicate this further. I was actually thinking about Maulana Abdul Bari Firangi Mehli, but then you've already talked about him, and I'm glad that there's an entire chapter that you've devoted to Maulana Abdul Bari. In relation to Maulana Azad, there's just one thing that I am interested in, that in addition to this moment that you're talking about, and there is, of course, a lot for us to learn from this moment, but I'm also interested in what happens post-moment. So for instance, there is a question of nationalism, which becomes a very, very central question. And whether we like it or not, in the subcontinental politics, and particularly in India, the Hindu-Muslim relationship is in many ways mediated through nationalism. And it is very interesting to look at how Azad navigates between Islam and nationalism. His very, very interesting essay, Islam and Nationalism, that came out in 1927, is kind of also, it helps us, kind of complicate this further, because this whole Hindu-Muslim relationship does not really, of course, the moment that you refer to is an important moment, but I am interested in something that happens later, and how the discourse of nationalism, the narrative of nationalism is just too powerful to not kind of look into. So that is just one. And alongside, I'm also, and this is something that I keep talking about to many of my colleagues here in India as well, that it's quite unfortunate that someone like Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar is hardly referred to. Because particularly in relation to Hindu-Muslim relationship and communal representation, patriotism, etc., and more specifically post-Khilafat movement, the kind of nuanced reflections that Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar offers, it's very surprising that we don't talk about him. So maybe, I don't know, I really look forward to your work, that whether there is a section on Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar or not. And lastly, which is in relation to what happens as a result of the failure, quote unquote, of the Khilafat movement. There is a certain kind of a compulsion, if I may, in relation to Hindu-Muslim relations that Muslims have to endorse, because the Hindus kind of tagged along. And therefore, now that things didn't really go down that track, and now that we are back to business, as it were, so now Muslims have to actually come forward and play their part. And it is here that in incredibly markedly insidious ways, communalism would kind of disguise itself as nationalism. And this is something that Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar very, very eloquently points out. So I think this whole reversal in a way that happens post-Khilafat movement, and the unanticipated consequences, if I may use that phrase, of the failure of the Khilafat movement, and what kind of turns or what kind of unfolding happens in the subcontinent of politics, is something that I was interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irfanullah. That was an excellent set of comments. To respond to, let me respond to your final point, actually. I think you're up to something very important and interesting. And a somewhat similar argument is also made by Sharjeel Imam, whom I talked about earlier in that speech of his, where he argues that it is precisely, so the term I want to pick on is the failure of the Khilafat movement. So in some ways, yeah, the failure is that the caliphate does not survive and after the Kemalist takeover. But in some ways, there are some ways in which the Khilafat movement continues to impress upon Muslims and the whole texture of Hindu-Muslim relations in very important ways. And that's precisely what you point out here. And Sharjeel Imam also mentions this in his speech, that it is precisely this moment of the Khilafat movement where figures like Abul Kalam Azad, well-intentioned with their own kind of intentions about preserving the caliphate, they cede that ground to a certain logic of Hindu majoritarianism on questions like cow sacrifice, etc. So he makes this very provocative argument that this is the history precisely of the present that we're living in right now, that it is a huge price that we've had to pay. It's precisely that moment of so-called Hindu-Muslim intimacy and friendship that has now paved the grounds for the rise of this monstrous form of Hindu nationalism in the form of things like, the cow protection movement and so on and so forth. So the connections that he draws between a certain kind of a Gandhian notion of friendship and the emergence of Hindu nationalism and its forms of anti-Muslim violence is quite interesting, and that's one thing I want to pick on there. But no, I actually don't look at Maulana Johar. I think you're absolutely correct. It's a figure that I have not had the chance to look at very carefully. All of these South Asian thinkers, when they write really copiously, and to really get at their logics, you have to really read their texts carefully. So I actually have not had a chance. You should write on him. I think it's such a massive archive that we want scholars to really write on it and connect it to the larger Muslim intellectual tradition and history. I think that's really important, to connect it to the pre-modern traditions, to connect it to the larger Islamic intellectual tradition. I think that's really important for the study of South Asian Islam, so that one can see how Abul Kalam Azad connects to Baqillani, Ghazali, etc. And the kind of pre-modern valences, I think, are very important to explore, so that we can connect the study of South Asia to the larger field of Islamic studies and to this kind of an audience.
Would anyone else like to come in and add anything there? No? Okay, we are coming towards the end of our Q&A session, but I think we have time for just one last question. So we'll take one more written question, and perhaps inshallah it would be good to get ending thoughts from all of the panelists on this question. This is from Sister Juwaria Asif. With the overarching liberal narrative that we live in today, and with it continuously dictating the good Muslim versus bad Muslim binary, how do we resist it? You said that we should resist these narratives, but is that possible without deconstructing what a good or bad Muslim is? Furthermore, the good Muslims are almost always somehow collaborating or at least flirting with the secular liberal order. We can especially see this in Kashmir and in India today. Such Muslims are overwhelmingly given positions of power. So doesn't it make it even more urgent to identify them, so that at the very least, a resistance narrative originating purely from Islam can be allowed to gain momentum?
Yeah, I think identify and then call out, right? The kinds of sort of shallow interpretations of the tradition that rely on this kind of a binary. Recently I'm seeing this article on Deoband, which is circulating by some person called Kamran Bukhari or something, that was recently sent out on Islam AR listserv. So this kind of shallow patheticness needs to be called out, but it gets tiring also, right? So basically, if one is always in this kind of a polemical back and forth and shooting down stupidity, that also can get quite tiring. So I think there is a question here that emerges, that in this marketplace of the good Muslim, bad Muslim, where there is a ceaseless appetite for this kind of compartmentalization and pathological narratives about Islam and Muslim actors, at what point do we do this kind of serious work that we did in the last 2 hours, this excellent conversation that we had with these excellent scholars, from which I really learned a lot and it was really enriching, or we engage with this larger marketplace of this kind of packaging that happens and goes on. So that's I think a conundrum in terms of the division of time and what is really politically productive. I've come to a point at which I think one has to just focus on this intellectual nuance, and I'm a bit tired of this kind of shooting down of these very unnuanced ways of packaging. But I think one can do it through scholarship. One can do it through this kind of intellectual work that we're trying to do here. So absolutely, one has to identify, call out, and then present alternative ways of looking at the tradition that resist these kinds of binaries and stereotypical depictions.
Dr. Hafsa, Dr. Suhaila, would you like to come in on that, or any final other comments as we end our discussion today? Nope. Dr. Suhaila?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, I agree with SherAli that I think scholarship is very important. I think people who have kind of positions in the academy or entering the academy have kind of an additional duty, I think, towards the Muslim community that oftentimes it's hard to always be public about, because I think the academy has historically kind of silenced Muslims or specific types of Muslims. So I think part of it is that we have to kind of be willing, I think especially professors who have kind of permanent positions or have institutional positions, to be more willing to take on these conversations and to create spaces where other Muslims can have those conversations. And I think we also have to think about building alternative institutions. I think oftentimes we simply look at the institutions that are already there and we think that those are somehow going to solve the problem. But I think we have to also think about alternative spaces, alternative institutions where conversations can happen, people can exchange ideas, people can publish ideas, right? That aren't necessarily confined to the traditional kind of mechanisms of the academy. And so I think, when we're kind of functioning in the public sphere, it's easy to fall into these dichotomies of good Muslim, bad Muslim, but I think oftentimes it can be more emotionally exhaustive than anything else. I think the hard work has to be done kind of on a daily basis through interactions and institution building.
Thank you, Dr. Sahara. Unfortunately, we will have to leave it there for the sake of time. We do have one more section left of the agenda today, so please do not leave just yet. But I would just like to point out that we do obviously have several questions that we weren't able to get to, but these have been noted down, and we will pass them on to Dr. SherAli, inshallah, who most of them were dedicated towards, focused on more specific aspects of your book. And hopefully we can get your response and we can attach it with the recording of this colloquium, which will inshallah be uploaded. So just before we end today, I'm just going to hand it over to Dr. Anjem to talk a little bit more about the colloquium for people who are attending for the first time, and a little bit more about the Ummatics project in general.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been such a rich discussion. I'll have to go back over and think about so many things. And I took down so many notes that I think I'll pass them to you, and in fact also to you, Suhaira and Hafsa. But I want to pick up on the point that Suhaira you were making and SherAli on questions of, and in fact, really it's a central point of two Muslim scholars arguing with each other. And you see, Suhaira, you went back to saying, look, we professors were tenured, right? That we took for granted the fact that there is an institution which protects us from the consequences of having unpopular opinions, right? And in a sense, it is possible because we are protected by a Western institution, Western academia, right? And that many of these discussions are less easy to have, in some places impossible to have among Muslims. But the best of our tradition has come out of precisely doing SherAli, what you recommended, which is that, look, you have good Muslims and bad Muslims calling out each other, Muslims disagreeing with each other, but at the same time, not destroying each other politically, or and recognizing that there are valid scholarly differences. And I'm thinking here, of course, but in the Mamluk period, to give you one example, people like Ibn Taymiyyah and his opponents are arguing, but Ibn Taymiyyah also protects them, in fact, and defends his opponents, or more generally, people disagree with Mu'tazila. Ash'aris are in fact define themselves against the Mu'tazila, but at the same time draw on them. And in some cases, people who are opposed to each other, are able to see their value, the value of their argument, even if their overall impulse is problematic. I was talking to one scholar as we were thinking about our contemporary differences. One scholar, for instance, who denies that Uyghur effectively genocide and almost justifies it. And we were talking, look, if this person walked into a room with us and it was time for Dhuhr prayer, we will ask him to lead the prayer, right? And that's a really different and powerful thing, that ultimately this person is a Muslim scholar and they're really, really wrong on certain points. But when somebody says, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, when somebody commits themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are certain rights that are no longer within your prerogative to take away from them. And this is an ethic that I see among the best of Muslim ulama in the past, that I think we need to practice. And institutionally, this means that we need to have spaces where we can really, really disagree with each other and be protected from the consequences of that disagreement. And ultimately, I guess, to turn it to connect to the point of the Ummatics is, to me, one of the fundamental motivations for the Ummatic project is, and of the idea of the caliphate, is that there are certain kinds of debates and reform that require an openness and playfulness almost toward disagreement that we're too insecure in our current condition to entertain, that having some kind of political protection, in fact, opens us up to more possibilities of interaction with modernity, more creative, more deconstructive. That was, in fact, happening to some degree in the Ottoman, toward the end of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, a very interesting attitude. There's a difference in Muslim attitude toward modernity and toward the West that happens after the First World War. So my point is that a lot of people talk about intellectual reform or spiritual reform, but I see political reform and the possibility of political independence and having institutions where this kind of freedom is guaranteed on Islamic grounds as really important for necessary. I want to go far as, I don't want to go as far as Azad, right, in saying that, everything we do is invalidated without the caliphate. But nevertheless, we need to start thinking about some very rational and felt embodied reasons why the idea of political reunification is, in fact, a precondition for some of our intellectual and social development. That said, that effectively is what the Ummatics Colloquium is about. And I want to take a few minutes, be open to, and to open up to any questions that anybody has about the Ummatics and how you may contribute. If you have any questions, raise your hand or type your question. I'll simply say that we invite each one of you, especially those who are in the business of academia and writing, whether in public intellectual or other or academic capacity, to join us, contribute to us. You may contribute by writing a short reflection essay, and if your academic work overlaps with some aspect of this Ummatic discourse, and today you've seen how far and deep it goes. We're not really just talking about everybody simply agreeing with or amplifying the idea of the caliphate, but really there's so many ways to engage with being Muslim and being Ummatic Muslim. If your work overlaps with that, and we invite you to do so in future for academics, write about it, think about it, and we'd love to have you to join and present in the colloquium. So those two things, join us either by writing or joining one of the streams, and stay in touch. I don't see any questions, so I think that that is
Okay.
that's the end of my my spiel here. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjem. Thank you to everybody for attending. Jazakallah khair to all of our speakers today and everybody who participated in the conversation. You can keep updated with new articles from the Ummatics Colloquium and future events on our website. If anybody is interested in contributing and getting involved, as Dr. Anjem said, you can also contact us through the website there. And yeah, other than that, I guess all that remains is for us to wish you a good evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever in the world that you are. Yep.
There's a question on the chat. How does a non-academic get involved by Ahmed Tardina? Maybe Dr. Ovamir can answer that.
Yep.
Yes,
Sure.
thank you
I
very
cannot
much.
see the question. Ah, yes, there.
Right.
Yes, Dr. Anjem, go ahead. How
Right.
does the non-academic get involved?
Right. We have to acknowledge our limitation at this point. There is more types of programming available on the way, where we do hope to have voices, scholars who are involved with the community, ulama, engage in these similar questions, but sort of closer to non-academic audience. That is in the way. So at this point, we just ask you to join and to register with us, and and our newsletter and read up until in a few months we will have some more initiatives directed toward people who are not in the academia. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem. Okay, any last questions or anything anybody wants to bring up? No?
Absolutely, and I want to echo what Bethana said, that we do encourage your comments and discussions on the pieces that are posted on the website. Well, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Jazakumullah khairan. We ask Allah to benefit us from what we learned today, and may Allah bless you, give you tawfiq in your endeavors. May Allah make the ummah and the unity and harmony of the ummah an ideal that is closer to us and one that inspires our actions and our thoughts. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.